I want to welcome you all here today. Thank you all for joining us. This is always an interesting experience being able to talk into a camera and not see faces back, but I hope you all are well. We're excited to have Adam Bryant here with us today on this webcast. Adam is the managing director at Merryck. He's been a journalist for over 30 years, including 18 years at the New York Times. And while he was at the Times, he's interviewed over 600 CEOs in his weekly column called The Corner Office. Adam also publishes a couple of really terrific newsletters on LinkedIn. If you aren't a subscriber, here's a quick plug for you, Adam. They're really insightful and some really great reading, so please do check those out. But our topic today is the new book, The CEO Test, Mastering the Challenges That Make and Break All Leaders, published by Harvard Business Review Press, which is co-authored by Adam and one of his colleagues at Merryck, Kevin Scherer. Adam's going to be sharing some stories and insights from the CEO test. I found it to be an incredibly insightful and an accessible book. The storytelling in there is really impactful, and the 7 tests, I think, will help shorten the learning curves that all leaders experience. So looking forward to hearing more from Adam on that. During our session today, Hannah Lee, our Director of Marketing here at Barrett Value Center, is going to be facilitating a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. At any time, I invite everyone here to submit some questions through the Q&A button on your Zoom session, and so that we can address those at the end. So let's get started. Adam, welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks to you and Hannah for the invitation. Great to be spending time with all of you this morning. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to present a deck, couple of highlights from the book, and looking forward to your questions. So with that, let me get my screen fired up here. And hopefully you can all see that. So as Chris mentioned a little bit about my background, I took this approach starting in 2009 with the Corner Office series I created at the New York Times of interviewing leaders and never asking them a single question about their companies in terms of like their strategy and their industry dynamics. It was just based on this what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them about their companies? And instead we talked about sort of leadership lessons they've learned over the course of their lives and how they think about culture and teams and hiring and talent. Just these sort of timeless questions, not timely. When I was at the Times doing Corner Office, I interviewed 525 CEOs. Since then, I've started a few series on LinkedIn, published a few books, as you've seen, also based on the patterns that just emerged sort of organically from all the interviews that I've done. I've got 4 series right now on LinkedIn. I do encourage you to follow them. Art of Leading is with CEOs. We're doing one with Chief Human Resource Officers, with board directors. Started a new one last fall called Leading in the B-Suite. We interview prominent Black leaders, having a bunch of the interview focused on race in corporate America. I have a partner on that project. I do that with Rhonda Morris, who's the CHRO at Chevron. I met her in 2019 and became friends, and that's just taken off. It's getting great feedback and really just trying to open up what can often be an uncomfortable conversation. As Chris mentioned, my co-author for the book is a guy named Kevin Scherer, who I met back in 2009, and we stayed in touch. And his resume kind of speaks for itself. I mean, just an incredible depth of leadership experience as a CEO himself, teaching leadership at Harvard. He currently mentors many global CEOs and also has pretty rich board experience. And when Kevin and I started this book, I mean, look, I'm the first to acknowledge there are thousands of leadership books out there. So we wanted to be really clear on the questions that we were going to ask and answer, and just be sort of laser focused on what our swim lane was in this broad conversation around leadership. So these are the core questions that we put on the whiteboard when we started this exercise. And I think the third one is worth focusing on, just this idea of ROI in leadership. I mean, there's that phrase in golf of paralysis by analysis, that if you're trying to remember and focus on 50 things when you're swinging a golf club, it's just not going to work. And so we want to say, like, well, what are the things that if you were to focus on them to become a better leader, what are you going to see the greatest return on that effort? What will provide the greatest impact for you where you can become a stronger leader? And the second one is also worth mentioning, just this idea of, what are the leadership challenges that all leaders face? Right? Because CEOs are often, I know the book is called The CEO Test, but it's not just for CEOs. The point is, like, what are the tests that all leaders face? And then what can we learn from CEOs about how to do them well? So again, these were the questions that we started with. And, after very hours and hours of whiteboarding, and, because when you start off with, well, what is leadership? You can easily start with a list of about 300 things. And so a big part of the process of writing this book is winnowing down to what are the core challenges, what explains why people succeed or fail in leadership roles. And these were the 7 that we came down to. And I have to say, we started this project obviously before the pandemic. And as we were going through the pandemic, we were always checking ourselves, like, do these still hold true? And I think the answer is yes. And anybody, who's part of an organization, I think these will resonate for you. If you're going to come out of the pandemic and emerge stronger, it's about having clarity around the strategy, a strong culture, a sense of teamwork. And, I think it's pretty clear to all of us that the basic skill of listening has become so much more important as we're working remotely. So the list goes on. So what I want to do just in the time we have together and presenting this short deck is focus on the first chapter and also the last chapter about the inner game, and just give you some highlights. These are this is the first sentence of the first chapter of the book. It's just quoting Kevin. And this is how he would often start meetings. If somebody came into his office, somebody on his team, and he would just say, what's the big idea? And so what? And it wasn't meant to be super provocative, but he was just trying to get them to get to the essence of what they were saying quickly. Anybody who's been in a leadership position, I think can, this quote will resonate with them, just that, because we've all been in that situation where somebody comes into your office and says, we've got a problem. And it's like, no, it's your job to bring a solution. And I agree with what Kevin says in the last sentence of this quote, that it is a leader's job to simplify complexity, and be right, of course, no pressure, but just this core skill of simplifying complexity. And in many ways, that's what we tried to do with this book. It is not a long book. We focused on 7 tests. Leadership is such a complex field. So part of the mission we set for ourselves was, can we simplify this complicated field? So this idea of, like, what's the big idea and so what, and creating strategy, you can probably tell why I shared this quote with you. I love Susan's notion of, like, cows, chickens, and taters. And it's just such a great reminder that when companies are articulating strategy, to really put it in simple, clear, conversational language. Some people like to reach for the $20 word to make things sound more, high end than they really are. So I think this is an important reminder as companies go through the strategy exercise. And also just her point that she adds here too, so that everybody on the front lines can understand it, right? That's another key test for us of an effective strategy. I've interviewed a lot of board directors over the years, and the whole idea of creating a simple plan, a strategy, often comes up in these conversations. And Don Canasi was a former CEO of Clorox, but sits on a lot of boards. And his insight here is that a lot of companies, when they develop strategy, they do almost as if they were an island, right? Companies can sometimes, and it's understandable behavior, but can sometimes become very inwardly focused and start talking about process and seeing, we have amazing products, but there's got to be this context of how are you going to win against your competitors? Don also talks about, like, what is your right to win? What is the clear competitive advantage that is going to make your products or services so much better that you have a right to win in the marketplace? And I think that's a really clarifying notion. So this idea of simplifying complexity obviously comes up in so many of my interviews, and why this is really important for culture as well. We all know that that cliche about culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that's true in some contexts, but I also think it's a reminder that strategy really sets the tone for culture, that if people understand what they should be doing and why it's important, I think that really can lift the morale and just kind of energize a company, as Bob Iger says here. So this idea of simplifying complexity, like that is a muscle, it's a skill. What does this look like in action? I think Bob Iger presents a pretty good case study in this. So there's an interesting backstory. Bob Iger was the internal candidate for the CEO job, and the board very much wanted kind of an agent of change, and it was not clear he was going to get it. And from the time he started lobbying for the job, he set this kind of 3 pillars of Disney's growth that he presented to the board. And what's been interesting is that he has never wavered from these 3 core things throughout his entire run as CEO. And in many ways, when you look at Disney's growth, this is what has driven it. But this is, to me, is what simplifying complexity looks like in action. So why is this so hard? Why do companies struggle with simplifying complexity? And I think part of the challenge is from this simple word that we all use called strategy. And what I've come to appreciate is that this word is kind of like a Rorschach test or a classic ink blot. The problem is that people, when they hear that word, it means different things to different people. You know, I'm journalist by training. I didn't go to business school. I used to think that everybody understood what this word meant. But again, people have different interpretations of what it means. So how does this play out in practice? We do it in our consulting firm. We do a lot of work with leadership teams. I've seen a lot of strategy decks. And the pattern that I've seen is, you know, I almost frame it in terms of different altitudes and how people talk about strategy. So when you ask a simple question, what's your strategy? Some people go to this sort of very high level, just kind of almost a general description of what the company does. This is taken from the strategy page on the website of a Fortune 50 company where they say what their strategy is. And to me, this is an example of the problem that I just identified, because this is not a strategy. This is what companies do, right? This is just, you know, that general description rather than being a clear indication of what the company is trying to achieve. At the other extreme, sort of at a lower altitude, you ask people what their strategy is, and people will often give you sort of long lists of priorities and initiatives for this quarter, like they go too far down into the weeds. And what's missing is, you know, this middle layer that, for lack of a better term, we call a simple plan. So what does that look like in practice? How do you develop one? I want to acknowledge that it takes a lot of time just up front, right? Even though it's simple is hard, as we all know. And this is a great reminder from Tracy, who's done just a ton of turnarounds, that you have to take the time to figure out what the sort of key things that you're going to measure. And again, she talks about the point that I made earlier, that how strategy, if you get it right, it has an incredibly positive impact on culture, because people then understand what they should be doing to help drive the company. Now, the simple plan, like there's lots of strategy frameworks out there already, and you all know them, right? We all heard of KPIs and OKRs, and Salesforce developed this V2MOM framework that works for them. And they're all fine. I mean, they all have value. I'm not criticizing them, to be clear. But we just found, in all my reporting and talking to CEOs, that the best approach I heard of came from Dinesh Paliwal, who recently stepped down as CEO of Harman. And he also makes the point, like, look, this is really hard. But his exercise when he worked with his board was to boil everything down to one page. And there were 4 parts to it. This is what he would present to the board. And again, you can fit all this on one page, just a summary description of what you're trying to achieve, the 3 or 4 things you're going to have to drive to make that happen. The third part is acknowledging the reality of the challenges you face. And then finally, just how are you going to measure progress? Now, what does that look like in practice? Hey, Adam, give me a case study. So I can share with you a case study. It happens to be very close to home for me. Because I worked at the Times for 18 years up until 2017, and was very much involved and had a front row seat on the transformation of the Times from a print paper focused company to much more of a digitally focused, subscriber focused organization. So before 2015, they brought in a new CEO, Mark Thompson from the BBC, and he was brought in to get the company and on a better path and to work through this transformation. And they published this document. This is not an internal document that's a secret or anything. This was published to the world. And in there, the strategy document, to me, is like clear examples of the different elements of a simple plan. So here I mentioned to start with a concrete, succinct summary of what you are trying to achieve. And to me, this is a great example, right? Because within this sentence, you have some specificity, getting the digital revenue, getting those trend lines, print was declining, digital was going up, but getting them to cross in the right way. And he also includes a why in here, like, why is this important for the company? So then we talked about, well, how are you going to do that? What are the 3 or 4 levers you're going to pull to achieve that goal? And in this document, you can see these bullet points, right? These are some of the ways that they were going to achieve that goal. And what's very clarifying for me is that you can imagine somebody being put in charge of each one of these initiatives and having their own teams and having their own simple plan to contribute to the broader organization's simple plan. So let's talk about, like, well, what are the challenges that the company is going to face? That was not in that strategy document that I just alluded to, but it was included in this document. So this was written in 2014. There was a committee in the newsroom that I was recruited to be a part of to study innovation in the newsroom and what the company could do. Interesting backstory to be aware of, that this document is a 100-page document, very tough and blunt language about the challenges that the Times was facing. This was intended for an audience of about 10 people within the company. But shortly after we submitted the document, it was leaked to the public at large on BuzzFeed. And so there was this incredible big gulp moment of, oh my gosh, the Times is sort of acknowledging all the challenges it faces. But it was a transformative moment because it kind of set a level playing field on, let's just be realistic. Yes, the Times has many strengths, but what are the challenges? And these were just a few examples of those challenges that were called out in this report. So again, that became the part of the conversation. Let's at least be realistic and acknowledge the challenges we face. And then finally, the fourth part is to have that scoreboard. And this was the goal that they set back in 2015. And keep in mind, this was a very big goal at the time. A lot of the Wall Street analysts sort of said, you think you can reach that? That's a real stretch. You almost never see this kind of sentence in company strategy documents because it is risky. The CEO is putting their job on the line. Like, what if you get to 2020 and you haven't hit this mark? All of a sudden, the board can say, hey, you didn't achieve what you said you were going to achieve. And by the way, the punchline on the story is that the Times has blown past this milestone and then some, just in terms of the success of their transformation effort. I think this is a great insight from Ron Williams of the purpose of the simple plan. And it's not, especially in this time where there's so much disruption and there's going to be some other crisis coming our way. It's not that it's a prediction of how the world is going to play out, that some sense that what the future is going to look like. It's just that so you can adapt and pivot quickly if you need to. So we've worked with a lot of leaders and worked on a lot of simple plans, and I've seen some patterns just in terms of what good looks like in terms of the leaders who do them and also the plans themselves. So a few tips I want to share. I have to say, if I had a magic wand, I'd probably get rid of the word priorities from business conversations. And the reason is that priorities are kind of fuzzy and amorphous. They can often default to just this sense of like stuff we're always working on. And I think outcome is a much better word because it's very specific. It's the answer to the question, what are we trying to achieve by when? Another way to think of this, like 12 months from now, what are the 3 things we need to have accomplished for us to look back at the year and say we had a good year? Because the problem with the word priorities is, again, I've looked at a lot of simple plans. I've looked at a lot of lists of priorities. And the poker tell for me is when you see bullet points on those lists that begin with the same first two words. And those two words are continue to. And I see those words a lot on the priority list. Now, if there's something there that you're going to continue to do because you've always done it and will always do it, then I don't think it's a priority. And so that's why you sometimes get these priority lists that are so long. You have to be ruthless about editing them down. And you have to resist this impulse to say, well, we want to have a kind of comprehensive view on what the business is. No, that's not the point. The point is, what are the things that you're going to apply that kind of extra intensity and effort and resources to achieve these specific goals? That's the point of the simple plan. And it should be, this idea of making yourself uncomfortable, right? There is an art form of setting a stretch goal. Like if you make it too high, it's just going to be demotivating because people say we'll never get there. But what I often see is the opposite problem, where the simple plans are just this kind of safe, we're going to continue doing what we're doing without any stretch goal in there. This other phenomenon that I have seen, I saw it when I was an editor in my journalism career, and I now see this in the corporate world, this phenomenon that I call expertitis, which is that people become too close to their subject matter. They may have grown up in the company, grown up in the industry, and what is obvious to them is not obvious to everybody else. They sort of assume everybody knows all this stuff, when in fact they don't. So, it is just this ability to sort of step back. And sometimes you need people on your team to be able to remind you, like, I know this is clear to you and it's really clear in your head, but it's not clear to everybody else. So this is another phenomenon. You have to think of a new employee on the front lines who just joined the company. Will the strategy be clear to them? Now, once you have the simple plan, I always say you're halfway done. Then it becomes a matter of communicating it and communicating it relentlessly. This is a lesson that I've heard from CEOs that they've learned over and over. It's almost like you have to become a politician and just, repeat it and to the point where, even if you think everybody knows it, they're probably just starting to hear it. I love a good metaphor, and Laurel, who ran the WNBA, she's one of the mentors for us at Merryck now, but I love her metaphor of bunnies in the box. Like as a leader, you kind of set the strategy, you get all the bunnies in the box, and then we're good, right? And then you turn your back and all of a sudden everybody's going off in their own direction. And that happens because it's just human nature. People start creating their own narratives for how they're contributing to the strategy. And you always have to be reminding people, getting the bunnies back in the box of like, this is what we're all working on together. So that's the first test that we call out in the book. And it is the first for a reason, because you have to get the strategy right. Everything flows from that. If you don't get it right, it doesn't matter how strong your culture is, it's not going to overcome a bad strategy. So I do want to focus just briefly before we go to Q&A on this idea of the inner game of leadership, chapter 7. And part of the backdrop for this is, look, leadership is really hard, right? And it's hard for people who are learning how to become leaders. And one of the things that I've really come to appreciate is that I think one of the reasons it's hard to learn how to lead is there's so much contradictory advice out there, right? I mean, for every leader who's told me that they lead from behind, I heard others who say lead from the front. And again, there's just like, if you read enough leadership advice and click on the headlines that are out there on the internet, be compassionate. No, you got to hold people accountable. And this whole idea of patience and urgency, the list just goes on and on. There's so much contradictory advice. And the important insight for me was that these aren't contradictory. These are simply the paradoxes of leadership. This is why leadership is so hard. And the point is not to frame them in terms of, is it this or that? The construct is much more, it's this and that you have to lead in a certain way depending on the context and depending on the moment. So should you be confident or humble? It's like you need to be both, but again, you need to know what the right response is of the moment, what the moment demands. And again, all these sort of insights have been supported by quotes, great quotes that I've heard, and insights that I've heard over the years from the CEOs I've interviewed. This idea of urgency and patience, this is a really tough part of being a leader, like knowing when to push people really hard and when to hang back. But that is leadership, right? It's not one or the other. You cannot always be patient. You cannot always be urgent. It's just hitting that balance, because that's where the magic is, as Carla Cooper says. And we're hearing more and more about compassionate leadership. And yes, the impulse is great. Nobody's going to argue with that. But there are those moments when you need to be demanding. That's a leader's job. And I think that paradox is captured really well in this quote from Lucian, this idea of tough love, right? That is a paradox in and of itself. But I think it's a great way to signal that it's going to be both. And it just creates a really effective shorthand for me understanding what leadership is. Because we do talk in that last chapter about the inner game, the first 6 chapters about what do leaders do? What are the most important things that leaders do, and how do you do them well? And then in that last chapter, we shift to how do you need to be as a leader? Because that inner game is so difficult. I mean, you can often just see it in people's eyes. New leaders, they're sometimes overwhelmed. And to me, a big part of the goal of being a leader is just getting to sort of, the 3 C's of calm, confident, and credible. And I've interviewed so many leaders, almost always in person, and there is that quality. You can see it in their eyes. They are calm and they are confident. And why is that? I think it's because they've come to understand. It's a way that they've quieted all this sort of conflicting noise in their head by saying, okay, these are paradoxes, and I'm going to hit the balance point and then respond in the moment as the moment dictates. And this has been a huge challenge over the past year and during the pandemic, right? As a leader, it's like you need to acknowledge all the challenges everybody's facing, but you also have to provide some optimism. I mean, people follow confident leaders. You have to be able to set out a path towards success. So you have to be both. And sometimes people can err on one side or the other. So again, leadership challenge. How do you hit that balance of being transparency? But this is why leadership is so hard. And just finally, as a leadership test, like this inner game, we provide some questions at the very end of the book that, to me, we sort of frame as the ultimate test. And these are the kind of questions that I think people really need to answer for themselves in those moments where it's just, you and the person in the mirror. For the first question, people talk a lot about authenticity and leadership and why that's so important. And nobody's going to argue with that. But I think it's good to say, well, what does that mean? And I think people who are authentic really have a clear sense of self in terms of what their personal values are in the context of leadership and business. So they know what the lines are that they are going to cross and not cross for themselves. Even if it's at the expense of maybe, hurting their career or something. It's just like, no, this is my value system. And I also like the second question. I mean, if organizations were just a pickup game, right? And people could choose their own managers, like, why would people choose you? So that's just a quick overview. I want to share with you a couple of the highlights from the book. I'm going to come off the deck now and look forward to your questions. And I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Adam. That was great. That was a great overview of the first and the last chapter of the book, which really sort of hold the container for the rest of the elements within it. And, as you've mentioned and as Chris mentioned, I think one of the really important parts of this book is that it isn't just for CEOs, and it is for people who, play all kinds of roles as leaders, whether or not it's an official title for them or not. And I think that that's really important. So I know that you've interviewed, hundreds and hundreds of leaders, and now you're on the other side of the table. So we really appreciate you taking the time and taking our questions and stuff. As you were speaking in the beginning about strategy, And you mentioned that that is one of these words that doesn't have, has multiple definitions, and people don't really have a solid sense of what that really means. And I also know in previous conversations with you, that's the same with culture. And that's also one of those words that isn't clearly defined. So I'm just curious, from you, how do you define culture, or how have you heard the leaders that you've interviewed in a consistent way define culture?
Sure. To me, the most important two aspects of culture are defining this idea of like mission or purpose, and then secondarily, sort of the values or norms of behaviors. And what's so interesting to me is that I think companies used to approach this. They're almost like one-offs. It's like, okay, we'll take care of that, the mission and vision and purpose thing over there, these discussions. Then we'll have a separate discussion about values, and then we're going to talk about our strategy. And I think what we're seeing like right now, I'm so struck by this incredibly transformative moment that we're living in, where we're seeing companies over the past year with the twin crises of the pandemic and social injustice. Just there's been this kind of cultural stress test on companies, and cracks have been showing. And the way those cracks are manifested is that there are gaps that emerge between what people say and what they do, right? And so what I'm thinking a lot about right now is that companies, I think, are going to have to revisit their social architecture, is the term that my co-author Kevin likes to use, which is, those three parts. Like, how does the sense of purpose, the values or norms of behavior, and the strategy, how do they all fit together so that there aren't any gaps between them?
Right.
But that said, on this idea of purpose and especially the values, to me, the most important part of culture is this sort of the values discussion. And, I always like to frame things in terms of like, well, what's the bad movie version of that? And what's the good movie version of that? And the bad movie version that we've probably all seen is like companies go through the exercise at an offsite, come up with a bunch of generic words, then they put them in the wall in the headquarters lobby and maybe on the back of your employee badge, but they're never talked about again, right? People don't know what they are. And then even worse, there's the proverbial high performing jerk who is behaving in ways that directly contradict these stated values, and that makes people cynical. So that's the bad movie version. The good movie version, we provide a case study in the book based on this company Twilio out in Silicon Valley, is just sort of being incredibly thoughtful about what those values are, and that there are some specific behaviors behind the words, because it doesn't really matter what the words are. It's just if you keep double and triple clicking, it's like, what does that look like in practice? And then once you're really clear about what the values are, then they have to be reinforced at every touch point in the employee experience, from onboarding and hiring and quarterly and annual rewards and why people are fired. And it just needs to be part of the conversation, and reinforced at every moment. Because if you do that, then people, start to understand, okay, these are the rules. And you know what? The rules are enforced. Because imagine if you and I created a sport where there was no referees on the field, right? Some people would start playing dirty. So this idea, I think of values to almost like, these are the rules of how we play here, right? The sport of this company. And the key thing is, do you have refs on the field who are reinforcing those rules? And if you do, and people don't need to worry about that, then I think everybody kind of drops their shoulders and say, okay, this is a real culture. And if I want to get ahead, I've got to manifest and embody these ideas. And if I want to get fired, I have to contradict them. But then I can also start focusing on the work more. To me, that's what it looks like in practice.
Right. And and then often the conversation is, your strategy is what you're going to do, and the culture is how you're going to do it.
Exactly.
Like that. So they all sort of reinforce each other. And I think that that's what's really important is, and you mentioned in your book, that it's sort of unrealistic that leaders can do all of these things incredibly well. And so, going back to, a leader's own values and really recognizing what strengths they bring to the table and what weaknesses they bring to the table. You also have a whole chapter about building your team. And I think that that's also really important, because it's not just about what the CEO does or even just the leadership team, but how that, manifests itself throughout the whole organization. And, you have this not a framework, but, these kinds of things you really want to be thinking about when you build your leadership team, which I think is really important and isn't really talked about a lot.
Right.
Because it's really about the sole entrepreneur or the sole CEO, or even the way that we often reward people within organizations is based on individual performance. So could you talk a little bit about why it's important to be so conscious about how you develop your team?
Yeah, definitely. And also just want to speak to the point you started with, this idea of like tests. We want to make sure everybody understands that it's not about scoring perfect 10 on all of them. That's not realistic. And every leader has their strengths, and there's going to be it's going to be a bit lumpy on how people do on each of them. But we do want to sort of set this idea that there is a threshold level. Like if you are below 5 on any of these, it could lead to you being fired. So just point of context, on teams, I agree with you. I think a lot of people put together a team without being intentional about it. There's just this easy default of like, it's like, well, I have a team because everybody has a team, and you hire a bunch of, ideally A players, but you never really think or have an explicit conversation about the role of the team. And again, to me, the bad movie version of teams, I always like to say there's a reason why HBO ran Game of Thrones on Sunday night. It was to get people ready for work the next day, right? Because unfortunately, that's how a lot of teams operate, this kind of zero-sum game. Like, if I'm going to get ahead, I got to take you down, and all the politics. Like, we've all probably seen or lived that if we've worked at any number of years in our careers and organizations. But to me, we've always tried in this book to sort of simplify these ideas. And we did with teams come up with these kind of 4 threshold questions that you have to be able to answer. And the first one, it sounds so obvious, but it's like, why are you a team? And we ask that question with a lot of the leadership teams we work at, and they sort of like, well, we're a team because of course we're a team. It's like, no, why are you a team? And there is only one right answer to that question, which is to accomplish things that we can only accomplish together as a team. Because there's that sense of like, what are the big, hairy goals that require the resources of different parts of the organization to achieve? And that should be what the agenda items are on the leadership team meeting. But instead, what it often defaults to is like people get together and they just do kind of round robin. Let's go around the horn. Everybody reports out to the CEO or the leader of the team. While everybody's kind of looking at their phone under the table, right? So by asking that question, that drives to me a much more productive agenda about when you do get together. So the other 3 questions. So the first one is, why are you a team? Who should be on the team, and just being really clear about what good looks like, and not keeping people on the team just because they're like loyal and hardworking, just setting a very clear bar. The third one is, how are we going to work together as a team? And I think that's an explicit conversation that needs to be had. I love the example from a company called ServiceNow, where the leadership team created their own social contract, where during an offsite, they actually kicked the CEO out of the room for a part of it. But it's like, we need to have an agreement about what we can expect from each other. Because every team, you talk to enough leadership teams, everybody says the same thing. We want to have each other's back, right? We want to trust each other. And that doesn't just happen. You have to, well, what does that mean in practice? What are the behaviors? What can we count on each other for? And that if we fall down on it, we can kind of call each other out in a constructive way. So that whole idea of like, let's have the explicit conversation about how we're going to work together. And then the final question is, what is the leader's role on the team? And that does reflect on the leader. And I've seen too many leaders who, it's almost like they create this distance from their own team. And it's like, my team's so dysfunctional, I can't figure it out. It's like, you're the leader of the team. You set the tone. You set the rules for engagement. So just, making sure that the leader understands all the things that they have to do to create a high performing team. So to us, those are like the 4 questions that really need to be answered well. if you're going to have a high performing team.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it's building your leadership culture to support the culture of the organization, to support the strategy, all of these. I mean, again, like everything is so interconnected in the
Right.
in the different chapters that you're writing about, which I think it's really important. And you mentioned in your presentation, this notion of having to over communicate when it comes to the strategy to make sure that people are aligned with it, really understand it, understand how they can contribute to it, all of those things, because without that, they create their own narrative in their head about what's going on. And that's also, true around, culture, around all of these different elements. You have a couple chapters which are, very timely right now around transformation and dealing with crisis. And communication is such a big piece of all of those, and ensuring that everybody's kind of moving in the same direction and all of those kinds of things. So, I mean, it's also something that, because it needs to be reiterated so much, it seems like it's also something that leaders often struggle with. And do you have a sense of why that tends to need to be reinforced so often?
Yeah, and again, it's kind of human nature. I mean, if politicians repeat the strategy, every 3 or 4 weeks, they go like, "Why do I need to say it again?" Like, right. I feel silly. Like everybody knows this, and the point is they don't. I mean, to me, there was a great insight from a CEO I interviewed. He said, they're starting to hear you when they start making fun of you, right? So you almost have to give yourself permission to be teased. Right. Where people, I know exactly what they're going to say. And we hear this at companies. It's like, oh yeah, the CEO, it's like everybody, it's almost tiresome. Like he always says the same 3 things. It's like, well, that's a victory. Right. And just understanding that by the time that you are so tired of repeating it is probably when they're just starting to hear it. Right. And the other key insight for me is just, it was captured in this quote of like, never leave people a void, because if you leave a void of communication, people will think that something is up. Right. And they'll fill that void with their own narratives. And usually those narratives will go to a dark place, and from the moment I heard that insight in that quote, I've heard lots of stories from CEOs. Tom Lawson, who runs FM Global, a big insurance company, told me about this morning. He sort of had to rush in the office. He was late for a call. It was raining. He had to park at the end of the parking lot, rush past the receptionist, close the door, and was in there for about 3 hours. And then one of his colleagues came and knocked on the door. It's like, are we getting sold, or like, what's going on? And it's just because he rushed past the receptionist, didn't say hi, and people were reading all this stuff in his body language. And just that story, I mean, every leader needs to be aware of a story like that and make sure they're not recreating it, because people pick up on the smallest signals, like, oh, their shoulder seems to be slumped in a different way. There's always something up. Right. And often the smarter the people, the more elaborate the stories they make up are.
Yeah, it's true. And it's interesting to sort of think of human nature. And I guess it comes down to, our reptilian brain of looking for threats. And so right. it does make sense. And it's interesting. I mean, it's something to be mindful of. I'm going to look and take some questions from the audience now. What are the biggest leadership derailers you've seen? Traps that get people away from their best leadership?
Yeah, well, in many ways, the book is the answer to that question. But one thing I think it's worth mentioning we haven't talked about yet is just this idea of listening. Listening, it's not just about listening in the moment, one-to-one or small group meetings. It's more than this idea of active listening. It's really just sort of creating almost an ecosystem or infrastructure within your company so that you really understand what's going on. We quote a woman named Nell Minow in the book, who for years ran an activist shareholder fund. And she said that the companies they targeted, once you get inside them, all the employees would say the same thing, that if you disagreed with the boss, you might get fired. Right. And so as a leader, you have to just make sure the first step is to be aware that you are in a bubble as the leader. that people only want to give you good news, or all the data is massaged. I mean, you talk to people who move into the CEO role from the COO or president role, I would ask them like, well, what's changed? And it's like, all the decks I'm seeing suddenly become much more polished, right? You can't get upstream anymore in the process. So everything is kind of massaged and presented to you in this, shiny format. And the first step is to be aware of that, and then take all of these incredibly, deliberate steps to find out what's really going on in the company, because there's always problems. I mean, there's that cliche about no news is good news. It's like, that's not true for leaders.
Right.
Like, no news is bad news because you're not hearing the bad news, and it's always out there.
Well, no news is good news is not good for anybody, I think, and which is why the flip side of listening is so important in terms of the communication side as well. All right, let's see. What is the best example / story you've witnessed in your conversations with CEOs where the purpose and values have been chosen and seem to be more important than the demand for profit / bottom right-hand corner? I'm not sure what bottom right-hand corner means, but I guess the balance between the purpose and the values and then the bottom line.
Yeah, well, to me, the broad cut is it for profit or not for profit, right? And so I think if it is for profit, you have to sort of start with the idea that it is the leader's responsibility to grow the company, right? But then to do it in an ethical way that's in line with all the values. And, I honestly find the values exercise so fascinating. And I know this is the work that you guys do at Barrett, of course, but, for the most part, no two companies' lists are the same. Some of them adopt like the generic stuff about excellence and integrity and all those. But I'm always intrigued when you see something that's really specific. And to me, the best values, they kind of emerge organically from the company's culture rather than being imposed by the leadership. And the single best example that I've seen of that might, if you twist my arm and say, Adam, what's the favorite value you've ever heard? It's this value at Twilio that we mentioned in the book called, and the value is draw the owl. And the story behind that is that is based on an internet meme that has two panels, and it's like how to draw an owl. The first panel just shows these sort of three overlapping circles in the rough shape of an owl. And the second panel is a fully rendered owl. And underneath the caption says, draw the rest of the expletive owl. And when this meme started going around the internet, it went like viral inside the company and everybody just loved it. And what is that meme all about? What it means, like, just figure it out. Right. And just this whole notion of like, just draw the owl. Like, don't wait for somebody to give you a 100-page book on how to do it. Just draw the owl. And because this went viral organically, the company adopted it as one of their values. Their mascot is now the owl. They hand out, the awards, like you get a trophy in the shape of an owl. And to me, that's like, it's specific. It feels like unique to the DNA of the organization. And to me, like, those are the best kind of values.
Well, and it goes back to what you had said before, that the words of the values themselves don't make as much of a difference as it is the define and taking the time to really define what those look like.
Right.
And with the owl, I mean, it's adorable and it's fun to have that sort of legacy of the story. But if they didn't define what that was, anybody would be like, I don't know what you mean by that. Right.
No, exactly. And on that point, I mean, Jeff Lawson, the CEO, he had this great point in one of our interviews. He said, ideally, like, values should be like hashtags, right? Because when you say, well, what are hashtags? And what is the spirit of a hashtag? It's usually like, a shorthand for an idea, but it also feels like conversational. Right. Because it's not a big, like, did you act with integrity today, Hannah? It's much more, it's like, I love this new hire. She draws the owl every day. It's great. And you can imagine it being used in conversation as the shorthand for what everybody understands.
Yeah. And I mean, that's that what culture really is that unique differentiator of the organization. And even if you see the best culture out there in the world, there's no way that you can copy it. You have to create your own understanding and meaning and shared language and all of those kinds of things. All right, let's see what else we got. So obviously this past year has been one of many challenges. I mean, obviously the pandemic has, created a space for everyone to be in transformation. Have you seen any shifts and changes in terms of leadership behaviors or practices as companies have gone virtual?
Yeah, and I do want to say, like, I am often reminded of this idea. The way I think about it, Hannah, is like 50 years from now, if somebody sits down to write a book about, corporations around the world, 50 years from now, I have to think they're going to have to devote about 3 chapters to this moment we're living through right now. And I think we need to remind ourselves, like, we are living through a transformation of the role of companies in society, how work is being done, and frankly, the nature of leadership. And I think even on the other side of the pandemic, I mean, what has changed forever? I think one, we can officially call the death of command and control leadership, because anybody who sits at the head of the table and says, I've got all the answers, like, no, you don't, right? And you're going to lose credibility instantly. I think there's much more humanity that's just going to be part of leadership. There's just this whole idea of like listening and how are you? And, just the idea that how are you has become a meaningful question. Like, no, really, how are you doing? And the wall between the personal and professional has come down. So I think leaders have to lead with much more humanity. And also just embracing these paradoxes that I mentioned in the inner game, because it is, all this is true in the remote environment, right? Like, how do you be compassionate? Like, and we all have had to be compassionate. You got to give everybody a break because you're dealing with a lot at home, but there are those moments where everybody's got to step up and sort of understanding all those things. So I think leadership is going to be better on the other side of this. I think leadership is going to become more important. And all those basic skills of leadership, of when you've got people working at home, you've got to work that much harder to make sure this strategy is really concise, to communicate it. Right. Because the way it used to be is, the whole idea is if people were in the office, that was a proxy for productivity. It's like the parking lot's really full, like we're rocking it today. It's like, no, that's kind of an old way of thinking. You've got to be, it is a leader's responsibility to be clear on what everybody should be working on and why. Right. So it doesn't matter where they're working. And then you can measure it. It sort of goes back to that simple plan of like, can you cascade it through the organization so that everybody knows what they should be working on?
Yeah, I mean, you don't run into somebody on the way to the kitchen to have those conversations. They have to be much more intentional. Right. But that doesn't mean that any of these things need to stop. It's just, just different, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also part of it is that, this notion of command and control has to be let go of, and you have to trust people. Do you ever think that there'll be a time where we aren't reminding leaders that they have to be human beings and express their humanity?
Well, I think we're always going to have to. And I think it's because leadership is hard. I mean, I think, part of what you're asking is, I always think about it, it's like, why are there so many bad bosses in the world, right? And there's always going to be bad. And I think part of the one reason why there are so many bad bosses, because leadership is hard. And so people in that kind of insecurity and vulnerability, they sort of say, well, I'm going to adopt my leadership style, right? They grab for something. It's like, this is me and the world has to accommodate me, and the world doesn't accommodate you. And when it doesn't, you sort of double down and you get angry and frustrated and all that other stuff. And, I think we're always going to have bad bosses. I just hope we have fewer of them. Right.
Well, yes. And I think that's one of, the notion of, obviously there's books that you can read and there's, but, I think if you mentioned in the book that experience is really the best teacher, and, how these play out in our lives, and, all those kinds of things, I think is really important. And, beyond an author and a former journalist, you're now the managing director of Merryck & Co., and which is a global leadership development mentoring organization. And as part of the process, I know that you do use our leadership values assessments as part of that, to really have that moment of feedback with a leader to understand. And I think that part of that experiential learning is really to see yourself reflected back in others. And so I think that that's something that's also really important, because not only are leaders not hearing what the challenges are within the organization, they're also possibly not hearing about the challenges that people are having with them.
Right. Yeah, and to me, the way that all ties together, it's like, yes, experience is the best teacher, full stop. But I think, what you guys believe at Barrett, what we do here is that, can you shorten the learning curve? Right. And, with the work that you do, can you help people better understand how the world perceives them and close those, illuminate those blind spots? And so that's, I think, our shared goal, which is like, can you shorten that experiential learning curve? So that what might take somebody 30 years to figure out, they can learn much earlier and then be a better leader for it.
Right. I can't believe how fast time has gone. I don't even know if we have time for one. Well, let's take one last question, if you don't mind.
No, I'll be brief.
Okay. Let's see. So one of these questions is, just basic. Do you have a definition for leadership?
Yeah, I think it's just creating a vision and that inspires people. And because to me, that's the difference between management and leadership, is like, do you inspire people? And vision is one of those big words, but it's like, do you have sort of a plan that gets people excited? And are you clear about not only the destination, but how people are going to work there to achieve it? Right. I think it's simple as that, and as hard as that.
Well, and that's the concept, I think, with the book. The accessibility and the way that you break these things down makes them, it simplifies them, but they aren't simple things. So
big difference.
So I think that is really important. And yeah, it's as simple as and difficult as that. Well, I am going to invite Chris to come back and close us out. But I will just say, I've really appreciated this time with you and the conversation that we are able to have.
Appreciate it.
Great. Yes, thank you again, Adam. The conversation today has been fantastic. I deeply appreciate the time you've given us today and sharing your stories. And also want to appreciate you, Hannah, for moderating and facilitating the conversation with Adam on this webcast. And thank you all for joining us today. And I hope we found something that has been interesting or even maybe inspirational as we all go and do our work with leaders in other organizations or even our own organizations. So that was the intention for today. We will be sharing a link for the recording and other resources from this webcast, including how to obtain a copy of the book or how to connect with Adam on LinkedIn. I wish you all a great rest of your day. Be well, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.